Thank you for coming out in support of the Barnes & Noble at Boston University author series and Jared Diamond. Guns, Germs, and Steel is Mr. Diamond's second book, which won him the Pulitzer Prize in 1998. He's written 7 books and over 500 articles for magazines ranging from natural history to discovery on topics such as ecology and physiology. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Science, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Mr. Diamond is also a professor of physiology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jared Diamond.
For me, it's a very unusual pleasure to be with you this evening because I was born and brought up in Boston, and so I have a lot of associations, including associations with Kenmore Square. I grew up in a house next to Brookline High School, where I went to kindergarten. I went to John D. Runkle School, the public school about a mile away from Brookline High School. Went to Roxbury Latin School. I was at college. I was a postdoc in Boston. And I wanted to mention 2 particular associations with Kenmore Square. First, as a boy, I had orthodontic work done on my teeth in downtown Boston. And once I got to be about 10, my mother would put me on the trolley line or the bus to Kenmore Square, where I would change, get a transfer.
We're just going to project.
Can you hear me okay in back? Or can you hear okay all the way in back? All right, I'll project. Can you hear better in back? So as a child, for my orthodontic work, I would take the bus to get one of those little transfer slips in those days, right out here, and then take the underground trolley line to the downtown area, Arlington Street, where the dentist did orthodontic work on me. So I had weekly associations with Kenmore Square as the place as a child to negotiate a transfer. And then my other associations with Kenmore Square are that as I came in by taxi from the airport this evening, I got into a discussion with a taxi driver about the Boston Red Sox, because growing up here in 1948, I was here at the time when the Red Sox were in the World Series. I personally met the great Ted Williams. I was there at the time when the Red Sox had Johnny Pesky at shortstop. These names, because of my great age, are undoubtedly more than any of you will remember. But Johnny Pesky, Bobby Doerr, Dom DiMaggio, and Johnny Mize were on the Boston Red Sox in those days. I lived through the disappointment of the 1948 World Series, and I lived through the unforgettable thrill of Ted Williams' comeback after the Korean War. All that happened at Fenway Park, just a short distance from here. And so for me, it's really quite a moving experience to come back to the scene of these events of my growing up. Well, you come here not to hear about associations of Fenway Park 55 years ago, but instead, probably because you're interested in history or my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. So I wanted to tell you something about how I came to write the book, what's in it, and then I would like to tell you about an interesting spin-off from the book after I wrote it. The book is a comparison of how history unfolded on the different continents for the last 13,000 years. And as an example of the question that the book is concerned with, if one had come to the side of this room 500 years ago, all the people that one would have seen around would have been Native Americans. And now most of the people that I see here are evidently not Native Americans, but are of Old World ancestry. Someone has to ask, why did history unfold that way instead of the opposite way? Why was it not the case that Native Americans went and conquered Europe and nearly exterminated Europeans, et cetera, et cetera? So the subject of the book is the comparison of the course of history on the different continents for the last 13,000 years. The subject is well indicated by the subtitle of the British edition of my book, which my American editor declined to use. The British subtitle is A Short History of Everybody for the Last 13,000 Years. A bit whimsical, but it is a fair account of the content. As for how I got into an interest in this subject, having been born in 1937, grown up during the Second World War, and then having lived for 4 years in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, I learned early on that geography is of overwhelming importance in human life. Where you are born has more influence on the subsequent course of your life than anything else. I realized that friends of mine born in 1937 but born in Yugoslavia, Russia, Britain, Germany, Japan had very different lives from my own life, and I began to wonder why, and I spent lots of my time in Europe trying to understand why. That sensitized me early to the question about how geography, about the profound influence of geography on human history. And then that interest got reinforced when in 1964, having been a bird watcher as I was growing up in Boston, I went to New Guinea in 1964, that big tropical island north of Australia, to study birds. And when I went to New Guinea, I was naive. I knew that New Guineans were so-called primitive people, meaning that New Guineans until modern times were using stone tools and did not have writing and were living in tribal societies. So I naively thought in 1964 when I went out to New Guinea, they are technologically primitive people because there must be something primitive about them biologically. And it took me about 1 day to realize that that was absolute nonsense. These are really smart, engaged people. I've been working there for 35 years. I learned quickly that they are at least as alert, probably more so, quicker to learn, more interested, more conversational than the average American or European. You send them to school, and in a few years they're piloting jet planes and operating computers. I can't do either. And in my 35 years in New Guinea of walking around in the jungle, the terms on which New Guineans and I have learned to relate to each other is that they know how to operate in the jungle and I don't. After 35 years, I still can't find the marks of following a trail, and I still don't know how to light a fire, and I still don't know how to build a hut. My New Guinea friends, it's clear that they've learned not to expect too much of me. Their attitude seems to be like the attitude of those mountaineering guides who are capable of leading a cow up the Matterhorn. Well, my New Guinea friends are capable of leading Jared Diamond around in the jungle, and they don't rub it into me that I'm obviously primitive, disqualified, but we understand each other perfectly well. They are the superior ones and I'm the inferior one in that environment. Why is it then that I came to New Guinea representing the society that had steel tools and they were the ones with stone tools? I began to wonder about that in 1964. The questions took a long time gestating, and my book, which I started to write in 1992, 1993, is about those questions. The title, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is the title that my wife suggested. Guns, germs, and steel are the agents by which some people, the people who developed guns, germs, and steel, were able to conquer, exterminate, and drive out other people who did not have guns, germs, and steel. But the big question of history then becomes, why did some people develop guns, germs, and steel before other people could, and as a result, conquer those other people? So that's the subject of the book. And obviously, I would have difficulty summarizing the answer for you in 20 minutes. Although the answer clearly has everything to do with the environment and has nothing to do with the biology of people. I think instead, what I would like to tell you about this evening, for those of you who already have read the book, and for all the rest of you whom I'm sure will now rush out and proceed to read the book, I would like instead to tell you about something which you find indicated only briefly towards the end of the book. And that's the following fascinating practical question. You may well say, well, here we are this evening to explore this intellectual subject about the broad pattern of history, but really what counts in life is becoming rich and successful, and what's this guy, Jared Diamond, going to tell us about becoming rich and successful? Well, you stumbled by foresight into the right place. I will now tell you how to become rich and successful. And while my book is not one of those self-help books that tells you how to make a killing on the stock market, I will nevertheless explain to you how my book will help you organize your business successfully and become rich and successful. The question is the following one. While most of my book is concerned with the differing courses of history on different continents. Why did history unfold differently in the New World and in Eurasia and in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Aboriginal Australia? I knew that I could not publish a book about comparative history on the continents without saying something about comparative history within the continents. I knew that at the end of my book, if I just treated Eurasia as a unit, of course people would say, well, Jared, why did history unfold differently in China and in Europe? Why was it Europeans who colonized the world rather than China, rather than the Chinese? And in the epilogue of my book, I discussed that question briefly, and in 7 pages solved it to my satisfaction. But naturally, since my book was published, the largest amount of interesting feedback that I've received about the book has to do with expansions of that argument about the contrasting histories of China and Europe. On the one hand, I've had much correspondence from historians interested in the different histories of China and Europe, who have expanded, developed in more detail the argument that I developed in my book. And in addition, I've been getting a lot of correspondence from economists and business people and people in industry who say the patterns that we see in industry are similar to the patterns that you thought you noticed, Jared, between the histories of China and Europe. Here is the problem in industry, and it's also the problem facing all of you who want to go out and become rich and successful. It's obvious that some companies are more successful than other companies. Why is it that Microsoft has been conspicuously so successful recently? Why did IBM have a turn down, and why is IBM now within the last 4 years seeming to spurt forward again? Or it's also obvious that different industrial belts have different successes. When I was growing up in Boston in the 50s and 40s, Route 128 was the center of technological development in the United States, and now one instead hears about Silicon Valley. What is it about? But Silicon Valley and Route 128 are organized very differently as a Microsoft and IBM. What is it about the differing organizations of those industrial belts that produce the different results? Or different countries? Why is it that productivity differs so much between today Britain, Germany, the US, Japan, and France? Or even more interestingly, why within a country are there such differences in productivity within a given industry? Why is the Japanese steel industry leading the world while the Japanese food processing industry has barely 1/3 the productivity of the American food processing industry? Or why is it that German metalworking industry is world leading while the German beer industry has a productivity less than half that of the United States? Well, economists began writing me after I published my book saying the patterns that we economists see in comparing the German beer industry and metalworking industry, or Route 128 in Silicon Valley, or Microsoft and IBM, are similar to the morals that you draw out of the comparative history of China and Europe. So let me reveal to you the moral that I draw out of the comparative history of China and Europe so that you can succeed what I have not succeeded in doing, namely so that you can apply these lessons and go out and become rich and successful. In the epilogue of my book, after having concluded that there are various environmental reasons why Eurasians were the ones to go out and expand over the rest of the world rather than Aboriginal Australians and Native Americans, I then asked, why is it within Eurasia that Europeans, rather than Chinese or the people of India or the people of the Fertile Crescent, the Near East, why were Europeans the ones to expand? And any of you familiar with Chinese history and Chinese technology know that there's a big problem to be explained there, because if an extraterrestrial being had come to Earth in the year 1400, landed on Earth, and tried to predict who was going to go out and conquer the world, or who was going to become leading in technology, it would have been obvious that the answer was China. Because just think of all the great innovations that China had to its credit as of 1400. Where is it that paper was invented? Gunpowder, printing, movable type, compasses, stern post rudders, bulkheads on ships, deep drilling, all that stuff. The answer to it is China. China led the world in technology and productivity in the year 1400. In 1400, China had by far the biggest ships in the world, the biggest fleets, the best ocean-going ships. And between 1400 and 1432, the Emperor of China sent out 7 gigantic fleets with 20,000 sailors of hundreds of ships, each of them dwarfing Columbus's puny little ships. And these Chinese treasure fleets sailed to Indonesia and to India and to Arabia and the east coast of Africa. And they were obviously on the verge of rounding the Cape, coming up and colonizing Europe. So the extraterrestrial who arrived on Earth in 1432 would have said, the Chinese are on the verge of colonizing the world, but it didn't happen. Why not? It's very instructive to see why not. China was unified under a single empire during the 15th century, as throughout most of its history. Until 1432, the emperor sent out fleets, but there was a struggle between factions in China, just as in so many other countries. And after 1432, the isolationist faction, like the isolationist faction in the United States in the 1930s, the isolationist faction gained the upper hand in China and convinced the emperor that it was a waste of money to send out these fleets. So the emperor first said, stop sending out these expensive fleets. And then the emperor said, stop repairing these expensive ships. And then the emperor said, the ships that we have shouldn't sail more than 20 miles offshore because that's dangerous. And then the emperor said, these shipyards, these expensive shipyards, let's close down the shipyards, until by the 16th century, China no longer had the wherewithal to send out these gigantic fleets. Whereas now just consider what happened with Columbus. Columbus was born in Italy. He tried to get support in Italy. He was refused. He went to France with his crackpot idea of crossing the Atlantic. He was refused. He went to Portugal. He was refused. He went to a first prince in Spain. He was refused. A second prince of Spain, a third prince of Spain refused him. The king and queen of Spain refused him. And finally, on the 7th try, Columbus got support from the king and queen of Spain, got his 3 puny ships, crossed the Atlantic, discovered the New World, came back, and other European princes, French, Italians, Portuguese, etc., who had said no, woke up, saw that they had made a mistake, started sending out their fleets, and the result was the European colonization of the world. In short, the essence of the differing histories of China and Europe was that China was unified in 221 BC and has been unified for most of the time since then, whereas Europe has never been unified. Augustus couldn't do it, Charlemagne couldn't do it, Napoleon, Hitler couldn't do it. The European Union today is having difficulty doing it even economically. And the reasons are geographic. The geography of China is that China has no significant peninsulas, whereas Europe has Greece, Italy, Iberia, Denmark, Scandinavia. Europe has 2 powerful islands, Britain and Ireland. China, no island big enough to be independent. Europe is transected by mountain ranges, Alps, Pyrenees, Carpathians. China is not transected by significant mountain ranges. Europe's rivers are radial, the Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone. China's rivers are parallel, close to each other, and were quickly connected by canals. So for geographic reasons, China was unified early, has stayed unified most of the time ever since, whereas Europe was not unified. Unity has advantages and disadvantages. With unity, an emperor or an empress, if he or she has the right ideas, can put all the resources behind those ideas. But all it takes is one emperor or empress with bad ideas to turn off development, and that's what happened in China. In Europe, it has never been possible for one idiot to turn off development, because there were always between 45 and 2,000 competing princes. And if someone like Gutenberg or Kepler or Columbus had an idea that was not popular in the land of Prince number 1, the inventor just went to another country, got support from Prince number 3 or Prince number 45, and once Princes number 44, 43, 42 saw the virtues, there was then competition, technology was adopted. That did not happen in China. And so because China was unified early, China dismantled its fleets, China dismantled its clocks, China dismantled its water-driven spinning machinery, China dismantled its incipient industrial revolution. In Europe, there was resistance against all these things, just as in China. There were European princes who said, down with printing. Britain in around 1900 said down with electric lighting. There were European princes who said down with cannons. But whenever that happened, the prince next door said up with cannons or up with electrical lighting. And the prince who said down with cannons was either conquered or saw his or her mistake and adopted the cannons. In China, in contrast, because of China's unity, one decision foreclosed opportunities over a huge area. So Europe's geographic disunity has been the source of Europe's strength. Now, there are also hints that too much disunity, of course, would also be harmful. If Europe were divided into 30,000 principalities the size of Monaco or San Marino would not be sending out colonizing fleets to the New World. This suggests that there's an intermediate optimal degree of human group size to become successful, productive, innovative, and rich. My economist friends tell me that that's the parallel that they see between world history and economics. Given a human group, whether the human group is a country or a business or an industrial belt like Route 128, you always have the question, what is the optimal way to organize that group? Should your group be one unit, or should you have several different units or lots of different units? Should the leadership be dictatorial, or should there be a lot of freedom to the individual groups? Should there be free communication between the groups? That way you may leak industrial secrets. Or should there be secrecy between the groups? If there's secrecy, then you're not going to learn from the people next door. The message of the comparative history of China, which has been hyper-unified, Europe, which has been, for geographical reasons, medium fragmented, and India, which has been, for geographical reasons, always hyper-fragmented, is that there seems to be an intermediate degree of fragmentation that is optimal for human creativity. And my economist friends tell me that that principle of intermediate fragmentation also applies to businesses. For example, I mentioned that the German beer industry has a productivity that's lousy compared to that of the German metalworking industry. Now, I can tell you, and many of you know by experience, that it's not because the Germans don't make great beer. When my wife and I go to Europe, we always carry along an extra suitcase to fill up with German beer, which we love greatly and take back to the United States. But the German beer industry has a productivity 40% that of the American beer industry, because the German beer industry is hyper-fragmented like India, whereas the American beer industry has an optimal degree of fragmentation. In Germany, the beer industry is organized in 1,000 different local monopolies. Most German beer is consumed within 30 miles of the brewery, because Germans have their idiosyncratic tastes in beer, and South Germans wouldn't be caught dead drinking North German beer, but worse than that, people from Garmisch would not be caught dead drinking beer from Partenkirchen. The result is 1,000 different local monopolies that do not get economies of scale, that do not compete on the international market, do not even compete on the German market. There is no pan-German beer like Budweiser or Coors. The result is lousy productivity. Well, if you are an entrepreneur and you want to become rich and successful, all of you who are entrepreneurs have undoubtedly been asking yourself, how should I organize my company to become rich and successful? Or look at Route 128 and look at Silicon Valley. What are the lessons that can be learned? If you were Bill Gates, you might approach this problem by setting up 100 different companies, organized in 100 different ways, coming back in 10 or 20 years, seeing which 99 countries went bankrupt, companies went bankrupt, seeing which company's organization was best. You would perform an experiment, but then it would be 20 years later, and that's very expensive. In effect, history is the story of tens of thousands of different experiments in organizing human societies. Human societies around the world have been organized in very different ways. There have been small societies and big societies. There have been societies closely connected with free exchange of ideas to neighboring societies, and there have been completely isolated societies. There have been dictatorships, there have been democracies, there have been anarchical societies. There have been societies that are organized into 50 states under a federal structure like the United States. There are dictatorships and there are Somalia-like conditions, freewheeling anarchies. In effect, world history tells us the story of tens of thousands of different experiments in organizing human societies, and world history shows us the outcomes for those tens of thousands of different societies. World history is something from which we can learn. Obviously, learning from history is not simple. Otherwise, the answers would be known long before this. History is complicated because human societies are complicated. And I think another thing interfering with learning from history is that historians themselves, professional historians, for the most part have not been accustomed to adopting what biologists would call the comparative approach. Evolutionary biologists, astronomers, geologists, historical scientists routinely compare different societies, and that's the essence of historical sciences. But historians tend to be specialists in one area of history. You get 19th century French historians or late 18th century Austrian historians, but it is looked down upon among historians to synthesize world history as Toynbee attempted to do. That's considered dilettantish. But only by comparing different histories can you extract these conclusions. And yet it's obviously difficult to compare different histories. There are problems in doing it. Nevertheless, if approached properly, I'm convinced that from these lessons of the natural experiments of history, we can see what worked and what didn't work in constructing human societies, and we can use that knowledge to apply to designing our own beer industry, or to designing our next Microsoft, or to improving the organization among firms in Route 128, or, as economist friends of mine are now trying to do, to advising Brazil and Korea and Poland what to do to advance or jumpstart their economies. In short, I find history not just an intellectually interesting subject, but potentially a subject which, in the hands of someone more entrepreneurial and practical than I am, would provide you with an opportunity for going out and becoming rich. I also wanted to say about my book that, having now written it and having a certain distance on the book, I cannot imagine more fascinating material than understanding this seriously. Then authors have to learn to be shameless, but this is true. I have not found more interesting material than understanding the long-term course of history of human societies. Why is it that writing developed only twice in human history, in the Fertile Crescent and in Mexico? Why did writing not develop in the Andes, in the Inca Empire? What was it about the Fertile Crescent? Today, the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Iran, Persia, Iraq, Iran, southeastern Turkey, is the infertile crescent. What was its advantage 10,000 years ago? Or the alphabet. Why did the alphabet arise just once in human history? Or domestication. Why were horses domesticated and zebras not domesticated? The non-domestication of the zebra had big consequences for African history. The non-domestication of rhinoceroses also had big consequences for African history. Sub-Saharan Africans were not mounted on zebras and rhinos on which they could ride into Europe and smush European cavalry on their little horses. Zebras could not be domesticated. Why not? That's one of those fascinating questions. Or why is it that, as you look at the faces of people today, people from the Philippines, people from the Malay Peninsula, people from Indonesia, the Polynesians, why do people over this whole expanse of the world, from the Malay Peninsula out through Philippines and Indonesia into Polynesia, why do all these people look so similar, and why are their languages so similar? Whereas if you take the same expanse within Africa, if you compare people within Africa, compare the Bantu-speaking black farmers and the Pygmies and the Nilotics of the Sudan and the Khoisan people of southern Africa. Why is it that there's so much more human diversity in Africa than there is in that whole tropical Southeast Asian realm from the Malay Peninsula out into the Pacific? all those fascinating questions are ones that really interested me when I was a teenager. They interested me even more when I was at college and after college. I played with them then. They were difficult questions and I gave up on them then, but 5 years ago I got back to what to me are these most interesting questions in the world, and I found that I think these questions are soluble. Go read the book and see if you decide that they're soluble. One final thing that I wanted to mention before stopping talking myself, because I'm sure that you have questions and ideas of your own. I've not attempted in these 20 minutes to summarize the history of everybody for the last 13,000 years, which takes 550 pages in my book. But for those of you interested, I will be talking this Sunday in Sanders Theatre, Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, where I will attempt in about 45 minutes to an hour to summarize the history of everybody on all the continents for the last 13,000 years, and you're all cordially invited to come along then if you wish to do so. I'd like to devote the rest of the time to hearing your own opinions or to asking questions from any of you, because I'm sure I haven't explained to your satisfaction everything about history. And then after a little while, I would like to break and have a chance to chat with you individually and sign books for anyone who would like to have books signed, and shake hands with you. And maybe in this audience is someone who was at Runkle School when I was 10 years old, and we meet classmates. So let's now see if any of you have any questions or comments or dissenting opinions, God forbid. Yes?
Why have, in your opinion, the people of New Guinea not moved from a primitive to a technological stage? Is it because of hyperfragmentation or too much unification or something entirely different?
Very good question. Why have New Guineans not moved to political unification and advanced technology? Part of the answer is that it turns out that the development of technology and of political complexity in human societies all rests on the dense human populations made possible by agriculture, which also produces food surpluses. You cannot, hunter-gatherer societies cannot feed people, do not produce surpluses that feed people who can devote all their time to figuring out how to smelt iron and build atomic bombs. But in New Guinea, there were wild plants, a few wild plants that could be domesticated, bananas, yams, and a few others, but there were no domesticable wild animals in New Guinea. Whereas the Fertile Crescent, the reason that Iraq got such a big head start, Iraq and Iran and Jordan got such a big head start, was lots of wild plant and animals that could be domesticated. And then you're right about the other part of it. New Guinea is hyper-fragmented. Any of you who've been in New Guinea or have seen pictures of New Guinea, you know what the New Guinea highlands look like. A washboard of mountain ridges that go up and down. When I'm walking in the mountains of New Guinea, in a good day, I can cover 1 mile overland. In a bad day, I can get half a mile. In a fantastic day, I can cover 3 miles because the terrain is just so incredibly rugged. That rugged terrain isolated people in one valley from people in the neighboring valleys. Therefore, New Guinea was never unified politically. It still is not unified politically. Interesting question, so I got long-winded. I'll shut up. Next question. Yes?
With regard to the China explanation, in what was it, 1425, China was the most advanced country, yet it has a long history of unification. How did it get to be the most advanced in 1425?
Right, yeah. Given China's long history of unification, after what I've been telling you about unification being bad, how did China get to be so leading technologically as was in 1432? Two reasons. Again, my historian friends tell me that China's unity was periodically broken up, and that there were periods when China was more connected to the outside and less connected. And my friends who are specialists in Chinese history tell me that the periods of the greatest technological progress in China was during the times of disunity, when China was more European-like, or during the times when China was most open to the outside.
The Warring States period?
That's one of those periods. Yeah.
Given that modern humans have been around for 400, 500,000 years, and you're more or less arguing that geography is destiny, why didn't all these things happen sooner than they did?
Very interesting question. Why didn't all this stuff, given that modern humans have been around for for, well, anatomically modern humans for 100,000 years and Homo sapiens for 500,000 years. Why didn't all this stuff happen earlier? Why was Barnes and Noble not built in 100,000 BC instead of a decade ago or whatever? The answer in brief is that it took lots of cumulative developments. The first developments were biological development in the evolution of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, which was essentially not complete until around 100,000 years ago. Only with 100,000 years ago do you get anatomically modern skeletons suggesting that there were still biological changes. But once the biology was complete, there was then a lot of cumulative development, some of which was probably the perfection of modern language, which is so essential for communication, and then a lot of it is the gradual slow development of technologies that were essential for other technologies. In the case of agriculture, the question there pointed out that agriculture was essential for triggering the explosion of human societies. But what is the use of having a wheat field of planted wheat if you have not yet figured out how to reap wheat, or how to store wheat, or how to prevent wheat from germinating, or how to sow wheat? All that involved 10,000 years of experimenting with wild wheat that hunter-gatherers in the area of the modern Fertile Crescent where there was wild wheat were carrying out between 18,000 BC and 8,500 BC. So there was a lot of cumulative stuff that had to go on, which led to the beginning of domestication, 8,500 BC. Yes?
I've had a question. This is probably an oversimplification, but you basically say geography matters, culture doesn't, because culture will churn and eventually something that will develop will eventually come up. Now, I've read Wealth and Poverty of Nations by, I think it's David Lanz, and he says that's not true. He says culture matters, and here's all these reasons why. I'd be interested, how would you respond to him, and what do you think about his book if you read it?
I have not read his book, but I am familiar with the message of it, and he's right, and I'm right, and we're talking about different domains. It would be, nobody should quote, I don't want you to go home and say, Jared Diamond says that culture is unimportant, because that would be ridiculous. We have to distinguish between short-term history over small spatial scales and long-term history over very large spatial scales. The larger the spatial scale and the longer the time scale, the less that idiosyncrasies of culture make a difference, and the more important the environment is. And conversely, on short time scales and over small spatial scales, idiosyncrasies mean everything. My book will not let you predict whether the stock market will go up and down tomorrow. That has nothing to do with domestication in the Fertile Crescent 8500 BC. The fact that the stock market is leading in Eurasia rather than in Aboriginal Australia, that is a question that arises from my book. Or another way of answering it would be to say that in Aboriginal Australia there were at least 250 different tribes which differed greatly between each other. There were nomads, there were sedentary builders of fish ponds, there were people harvesting wild seeds. There was a lot of variation within Australia. But over the course of the last 13,000 years, the end result was still that not a single one of those 250 tribes in Aboriginal Australia developed agriculture, whereas agriculture developed independently many places in Eurasia and in Africa. That, I think, suffices to make clear that environment in the long run was responsible for the start of agriculture in certain areas. But if you want to predict short-term things, you have to bring in effects of culture. And in particular, in understanding events of the last 500 years, the shorter the time scale, the more you have to consider effects of culture in an individual. Nevertheless, I will say that even historians concerned with small scales and short time spans do not take nearly as much account of geography and the environment as they ought to. Challenge. Yes?
First, I want to thank you for coming. I think your thesis is very provocative. And had I not known that you live in New Guinea, I would have thought that you were writing from a Wall Street perspective on history. And my question is, I just would like your perspective on, you seem to suggest that intermediate fragmentation is maybe the best possible environment for creativity. How would you relate that to the former Soviet Union, born in 1917, able to be have a nuclear bomb by 1949, and to surpass the NASA in 1957, and it being a very centralized, structured economy.
Yeah. Yeah, given this principle of intermediate fragmentation, how can one account for things such as the rapid development of the former Soviet Union from 1917 until relatively recently? The principle of intermediate fragmentation has a caveat, and that caveat is all other things being equal on the average in the long run. But there are lots of, quotes, particular circumstances that can override things in the short run or over moderately large areas. The best principles of fragmentation are going to be useless if you have bad leadership. Microsoft's success is undoubtedly due partly to having good organization, and it's undoubtedly due partly to the idiosyncrasies of Bill Gates. Also, I should make clear there are advantages of centralized organization. A dictatorship, if it has, quotes, the right idea, can put all the resources behind that right idea and get a lot of mileage for quite a while, as exemplified by the Soviet Union's quick development of an atomic bomb. I would say that sooner or later, they're going to make a fatal mistake, and that mistake is more likely to have really bad consequences. An example is China itself. If you think that you can't learn from history, just see how Chinese history repeated itself. Because China is so easily unified, 20 years ago, a few idiots at the time of the Great Cultural Revolution were able to shut down the educational system for 1 billion of the world's people. That was the same mistake that basically that China committed after 1432, whereas that sort of mistake is impossible in hyper-fragmented Europe. There's never been anyone in Europe who has had that much power. Yes, and back.
When I read your book, one of the things that it seemed to be saying was that societies that were more equal, more egalitarian, tended to be more peaceful. I'm not sure if I'm remembering that quite correctly, so I was wondering if you could comment on that, and if you think that there's any hope for having peaceful, more egalitarian societies that are also successful and are not conquered by others.
Right. Is it the case that I said in my book that more egalitarian societies tend to be more peaceful? No, I don't think I said that. The most egalitarian societies are hunter-gatherer societies. And I've lived among hunter-gatherer societies in New Guinea, and there's a fantasy that hunter-gatherer societies are wonderful and peaceful and laid back and don't damage their environment, all of which is nonsense. They fight as fiercely as the rest of us, and they damage their environment, but they have less potent tools for doing it. And so when my hunter-gatherer friends succeeded in nearly exterminating the tribe next door, they did it with spears and not with atomic bombs. So I do not see a correlation between egalitarianism and peace. And then the question, how today can an egalitarian society be peaceful? Again, having been born in 1937, the lessons that, because I was born in 1937, everyone learns the lessons from history that were rampant at the time that I was growing up. And for me, when I was growing up, in retrospect, the lessons of the 1930s was that in order to maintain peace, you have to do work. And that work may involve being prepared to defend yourself before things get really nasty and it's too late to defend yourself. So egalitarian societies have to be, peaceful societies are going to be destroyed by unpeaceful societies unless they maintain a credible power base. Yes?
Do you feel that the fragmentation in human society, in addition to producing technological advances, has also produced an unending history of warfare among the different fragments of human society? And would you care to address a balance as to whether the advances in technology have produced the ability for mass destruction as well, and what this portends for the future of human society?
Yeah, this is an interesting question about the relation between fragmentation and warfare and technology. In writing this book, I just learned so many interesting things. And one of the interesting things that I learned in writing this book has to do about the role of war in so-called state societies. Again, because I was born in 1937, I grew up to believe that state societies, modern state societies, are far more belligerent and destructive than hunter-gatherer societies. And when I went to New Guinea, I learned that that was not true. It's certainly true that when modern states go to war, they kill people on a massive scale in spectacular ways. But nevertheless, in just asking my New Guinea friends about their life histories, I learned that growing up in traditional tribal New Guinea, where every village was in a state of intermittent war with every neighboring village, for a New Guinean in tribal Stone Age New Guinea, the chances of dying a violent death were higher than, my wife's family is Polish, than if you grew up in Poland during the Second World War, which is about as bad a place to grow up as one could have in modern times. The rate of violence in non-state societies is very high. The reason for this paradox is that states assume for themselves a monopoly on force. In tribal societies without such a monopoly on force, when you want revenge against someone who seduced your wife, you go do it yourself, and the brother of that person then counter-kills, and then you get an escalating series of revenge murders. So that in New Guinea, the risk of a violent death is much higher than in state societies. Now, when state societies go off, they can kill large numbers of people in very modern ways, but still state societies have a great advantage, and that's, I would say, basically the reason I discovered that state societies prospered at all. Why did people allow state societies to take over? Why did people put up with tyrants and dictators? It's because tyrants and dictators were rendering a service, namely providing a lower level of overall violence than existed before the growth of state societies. Yes?
If you'd like to speculate, modern communications, internet, and so on, seem to be leading towards a more unified society. How do you think this will affect human creativity?
Modern technology, for those of you who didn't hear in back, modern technology and communications are leading to a more unified society. How will this affect human creativity? You have, of course, put your finger on my next book, which I've begun to write. My next book is about what we can learn from the last 7,000 years that will help us in dealing with the next 60 years. Because the key question for the next 60 years is whether there's going to be a Barnes & Noble at the end of the next 60 years. That's to say, the ecological problems that we see proliferating today, our assault on the environment, threaten destroying our societies not one by one, as happened in the past with the collapse of Fertile Crescent Society and Easter Island and the Maya and the Anasazi. But because societies today are connected and intercommunicating, you cannot get a collapse in one place without consequences elsewhere. Why are we now involved in Bosnia? Why were we involved in Somalia, which seems as remote from the United States as any place you can think? Because we Americans have learned that events in far parts of the world have effects on us. And the effects are not just the direct military effects, but they affect us because trouble over there produces immigrants who will come to our shores in the most desperate ways that are difficult to keep out. And they also produce spread of disease, and they produce refugee problems. So the world is now unified, and I hope that 5 years from now, when my next book is published, I will have answered to your satisfaction this question of what's going to happen with this unified world in the next 60 years. I'm not yet sure what the answer will be. Yes?
I think something that's relevant to your comment on levels of fragmentation and maybe some kind of optimum intermediate level is boundaries. And if you have a big unified thing, there aren't really very many boundaries. People are in a very uniform culture. There tends to be a single way of thinking and relatively little interaction with other mindsets, other ideas. And in an over-fragmented, there's just a cacophony of different ideas. Everybody has their own state, I guess, and And it's very hard to organize things into a larger structure to accomplish anything beyond a small individual clan. I'm sort of going along with your idea. For example, in Europe, you look at a lot of the innovators. A lot of them were not fully immersed in the society, but they weren't completely out of it. They were sort of part in, part out. And to make it more concrete, the British, for example, in England, a lot of the innovations, technically and socially in other areas, came from marginal groups like the Quakers, like the Irish, like the Scots, the Welsh, who were part in and part out of the society. When you're too immersed, you can't really see, it's sort of like, a fish is not aware of water. We're not aware of being at the bottom of an ocean of air. It's just there. And when you're sort of in the boundaries, you can see these things more clearly. Another example is, for example, comedians in the U.S. They come from the groups that are sort of part in, part out. And in the past it was the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh. Later on it was the Jews, the blacks. It's currently, and now you're seeing Chicanos and Asians also in comedy, because again, a lot of comedy involves odd shifts of points of view, frames. And people who are at those boundaries can see that a lot better than people who are inside it fully.
Yep. There's a great, among the virtues of political fragmentation includes the direct effects that I've mentioned and the cultural effects that you mentioned. In effect, each culture is a different natural experiment in how people grow up and how they relate to each other and what their values are. Yeah, so there are great virtues to cultural diversity. Maybe because there's lots of people in the room, I feel a temperature rising. Let me take one more question, since I would like to shake hands and chat with some of you individually. Let me take one more question, and then all of you have anything else, just come on up and I'll chat as long as you want to chat. Let me take the one question back there. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to say I use your book for teaching sophomores in high school in a course called Comparative History. It's been enormously successful. And this question comes from them, in particular your chapter 10, where you talk about the orientation of the axes of the continents and talk about the ease of diffusion of invention and domestication across Eurasia because of its east-west orientation. And the students wanted to know why you didn't think the Himalaya mountain range was an obstacle to that.
It is. Himalaya mountain range is a north-south barrier. Just to make the point clear to all of you, this was a question. If I had tried to plant a question, I couldn't have done better than this one. One of perhaps the most interesting single discovery I made in writing my book was the importance of east-west versus north-south axes. Eurasia is oriented east-west, long from east to west, narrow from north to south. The Americas are long from north to south, narrow east to west. Africa is long to north to south, narrower from east to west. And that those different orientations of the axes had an enormous influence on human history, in that things can spread more readily at the same latitude, same climate, same day length, same habitat, same diseases. So the plants, crops, and domestic animals spread rapidly back and forth in the old world, but very slowly in the new world. That's the reason why llamas never got from the Andes up to Mexico. They couldn't cross the Isthmus of Panama. That's why turkeys never got from Mexico down into the Andes. But there are barriers besides just latitudinal barriers, and the Himalayas are a prize barrier. And again, an extension of my book, Planted Question, is that within Eurasia, one of the other problems that India had going against it is that India is a miniature Africa. The Indian subcontinent has a north-south axis, and in fact, if you measure the rate at which crops and animals spread from India, after the development of agriculture in Meergod, in what today is Pakistan, agriculture spread very slowly into southern India because the crops had to adapt to rainfall regimes and latitudes and diseases to which they were not adapted. So the spread of agriculture within India, north-south, was much slower than it was within Eurasia. And as for the spread of Central Asian nomadic herding across the Himalayas, you are right. The nomads who invaded India in 1800 BC did not come over the top of Mount Everest preceding Mallory. They did an end run through the Iranian plateau. And on that insightful note, I think that's appropriate. Let me call upon Maureen now.
Available for purchase at the register behind you. I also want to remind you that if you'd like to hear Mr. Diamond speak again, he'll be speaking on Sunday, May 9th as part of the Roger Tory Peterson Memorial Lecture at Sanders Theater at Harvard University. And there are information pamphlets that were listed on your chairs. There's also some more available at the register behind you. We're going to move over to the law room, which is just adjacent to this, and that's where we'll do the signing. Thank you again.
Let's just walk.
Very objective. They don't arbitrary distinction that you went seeing an opportunity to apply that. Why wasn't that a barrier? To speculate about what happened to well, the answer is that the volumes don't go all the way to the ocean.
I don't see that.
There's water break. There's water to go around. There's land to go around. Alexander the Great managed to get into I'm delighted to hear that you using that book in high school. When I read the book, I thought that every high school should go. But just like really small things. Where is it? Yeah, right.
Now, Mr. Diamond signs his 1998 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. While signing copies, he listened to comments and answered questions.
It wasn't inefficient. I was so happy. I was upset that I learned an inefficient method, and I was really happy to hear that I'm a pretty fast typist, that wasn't really bad. Do you agree with the...
No, they're wrong, I'm sorry.
They're wrong?
Yeah, I've written an article on it. They keep saying it, but they're wrong. The alternative keyboards, especially the Dvorak keyboard.
What about Dvorak running the test?
Of course he ran the test. If a creative person would run the test, he was the best trained person to do the test. And there are people now who the evidence is overwhelming with this benefit.
So where is your article? I'd love to.
Discover Magazine a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you are welcome. Hi.
Hi. I had a question about what constitutes a domesticatable animal, and that seems to be a very important part in your book that I want to Why the zebra? Why can't the zebra be domesticated?
Zebra is so interesting that there's a whole chapter on the zebra. Basically, the problems with the zebra are temperament, it's lethal, that it cannot be lassoed, and I've learned since I wrote the book that it has an unsuitable social structure.
So it's not a question of trying to be at it and do it slowly and...
No. People have been at the zebra, and more zookeepers are killed each year by zebras than by any other animal. Yeah. They're really efficient. You are welcome.
I want to let you know how much I enjoyed it. You can finish signing. And to ask you to say hi to your wife, Marie, for me. I'm Josh Klein, Debbie's son.
Hi.
It's a real pleasure to meet you.
Oh, what a pleasant surprise.
After hearing about you.
Debbie is one of Marie's closest and oldest friends. Marie will be just thrilled to know that you came.
Know each other, so I'm giving this to my sister. I liked it enough.
Sorry, ma'am, this gentleman was
Thank
first.
you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just go inside.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming.
You are welcome.
Your first book is actually what got me interested in anthropology, and I'll be going for my PhD starting this fall. So.
I'll be done. Very good.
We got lots of books.
Well, I hope this one will reinforce your interest in it.
Absolutely.
I hope you
seems what it is.
Yeah.
I've read it over and over, so thanks very much.
There's the first step.
Sure. I will sign any number.
No, I got And also these?
Well, maybe you could sign this one too. I have to pay for these too. I haven't paid for these.
Okay.
You can pay for them at the desk?
Yes.
Sixth grade class. Couldn't work and help be an ESO.
Do some
Sorry to make you work so much.
No, you're the one who's working. Thank you for making me work on these.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you very much. I brought my son. This was 13 years old. The first time that we went to a reading. It was great.
How did his attention hold up through it?
Yeah,
Great.
He ended up sitting up in the front. It was very interesting.
Good. Yeah, my kids are 12 years old, and they've heard me talk a couple of times, but by now they're bored with it. They're defensive. If anybody else criticizes my talk, they'll say, Daddy writes good books, but they won't sit through my talks.
Did you go to school with Bob Stein, too?
Yes. Yeah, Bob's...
Good friend of mine.
Well, he and I were in the same carpool for 5 years. Bob Stein, Johnny Gross, Joel Harris. Is Bob Stein still in the Boston area?
Yeah, matter of fact, he's still living on Clinton Road.
Of course. Yeah, that's where we used to
in the house that he grew up in. He's living over there. He just retired from work there.
Incredible. Give him my very best wishes.
I will.
That's quite a surprise. Hi.
Hi, thanks.
You are welcome.
Fascinating book. Do you think that the East-West axis also explains why there was more biological diversity in the Fertile Crescent region, being sort of an intersection?
Possibly, yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. It is true that being in the center of a big continent, that's a very interesting idea that I'm going to have to think about, but you might be right.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, I've been enjoying this. I haven't gotten that far, but it reminded me of Rat Slice in History. Which
yes, indeed.
Quite a bit.
Right.
It's too bad the Native Americans didn't have anything to give back to the Northern Europeans.
That's right. There's been an
They
argument
died
about...
out too quickly, I guess.
Right. There's been an argument whether they gave syphilis, but the evidence is...
Against that.
Against
I think
it,
it came
yeah.
first.
Yeah. Sure.
Love to have gotten into an argument with you over optimal fragmentation of political entities.
Yes. There are certainly more things that could be discussed about that.
Thank you very much.
You are welcome. Hi.
Hello. I really enjoyed your talk, and I really love your writing style. I think it's very accessible, very understandable.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
Thanks.
You are welcome. Hi.
So is it safe to ask you a question now?
Sure. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could expand on the differences between Silicon Valley and Route 128.
Between Silicon Valley and Route 128. I am not the expert on that. I understand that there's a study, there have been studies made and coming out, but the short of it, I'm told, is that Silicon Valley had a more secretive ethos. I'm sorry, that Route 128 had a more secretive ethos, and that at Silicon Valley there was free flow.
A little bit too much consolidation then.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi. Haven't read it yet, but I'm very anxious to, so.
I hope you'll enjoy
It
it.
was a very good lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello. I enjoyed it. I'm interested. There seems to be this big coincidence that these far distant societies had they all developed food preparation around roughly the same
Right.
time.
That is a big question.
What was it that did that?
You'll find a brief discussion of it somewheres in here, but it has to do with these cumulative developments that one of the questions was about.
I remember that.
Cumulative development of human skills and also of the gradual extermination of the big animals that competed with agriculture. But that's a key question. Hi.
Hi.
It's interesting, when one gives a talk, I find that I tend to focus on a few people in the audience who are particularly alert faces, and you were one of the people that I was focusing on.
I'm very interested in the fact that you're willing to make statements about big patterns. Seems really unusual these days.
It's so interesting.
Very interesting. Me too. There's probably an underneath.
Was right next to the fire station. Now we'll do structure right by the fire station.
Thank you very much.
You are welcome. Hi.
My father's retirement party tomorrow in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Ooh. So is this for your father?
Yeah.
What is his name?
Larry Moore.
Larry Moore.
M-O-H-R.
And shall I sign it to him?
Sure.
It's up to you.
Yes, please.
You don't want to go on and watch.
I'd be very curious to know sometime how you integrate the physiology with the very micro with the very macro.
My physiology got more evolutionary within the past decade. It used to be divorced.
I got it up in Maine in summer. A little gift shop. They cut in the laser. Thanks very much.
You are welcome. Hi.
Hi. It was great listening to you. I actually bought the book months ago when you were interviewed on National Public Radio, I believe it was, and went out and got it that time. I've been reading it slowly, but I heard you were going to be here. I figured I ought to come down.
Good, so you're one of the lucky people who got the paperback.
This is one of the copies I bought and gave to my son-in-law.
What is his name?
Dave Lance.
David
Lance.
L-A-N...
L-A-N-C-E.
Shall I sign it to him?
Yes, please. I've been promoting the idea that this should be required reading at MIT for undergraduates. I've given a copy to the head of the humanities department, who's a historian, and he loves it.
Bless you. There actually are a couple of colleges that have made it required.
Yeah, I'll bet. Very good. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm looking forward to Sunday's lecture. I noticed your tie, and I just thought I should tell you that while I was living in Australia last year, I met a person there, another astrophysicist, that's what I do, and he told me about your books and got me interested in all of these ideas. And it's because of him that I'm reading your book now. And if you haven't met him before, you probably will. His name is Charlie Lineweaver.
Lineweaver. I'll keep his Lineweaver Burke for biochemistry. I'll keep the name in mind.
Yeah, astronomy. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Cosmic microwave background is what he does.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I owe you for these.
Okay.
I trust you.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
You are welcome. Hi.
Sir, may I thank you for writing about genocide in the Bible. You're the only man with courage enough to do it. Thanks for pointing out that Dutch had as much trouble domesticating zebras as the Zulu.
Right.
And that the farmers in Cameroon wiped out the Kayusan long before the Dutch. I think you've done a great service to humankind. In the chimpanzee, you asked why should women be promiscuous? I think it's so the miller's wife can raise the prince's son.
That actually is one of the serious arguments.
It's the only way I thought I could help.
No,
I tried all the rest.
That's not just a joke. No, that is one of the serious arguments behind it.
I think this is the book of the decade, sir. It rationalizes the liberal philosophy that we weekend liberals have never done our homework on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shake your hand.
Sure, indeed. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
I have a question. I'm studying Mesoamerica, and I found it interesting that the geographical barriers both to the north and the south. It seems like a really nice controlled experiment with so many different social structures going on through time as far as the unified Aztecs and fragmentary Mayan. I was just wondering if you thought it was really the if it was really the deserts to the north and the mountains to the south that held them up from all these different different societies through time not being able to pass through them.
Well, in brief, yes, but there are other things coming in there as well. Deserts to the north clearest, the narrow isthmus. Yeah, it's harder to explain the lack of rainforest continuity to the south. So, is this your...
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to say I enjoyed the book very much and your talk. I want to thank you for both of those things. I didn't go to the Runkle School, but I work on lactase with Dick Grand.
Oh, give him you bet, he was a classmate of mine. Please give him my very best wishes.
Enjoyed it very much. Thanks
Thank you. Hi.
Enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you, I enjoyed it. I have a question.
Yeah.
I haven't read this book or your previous, The Third Chimpanzee, but have you addressed the issue of whether there's anything in the genetic makeup of the human species where we are perhaps unique in the animal kingdom throughout our history as a human being have engaged in such violent, massive activity toward each other?
Yes.
In this book?
No, The Third Chimpanzee.
The Third Chimpanzee.
That's right. If you hurry downstairs and buy The Third Chimpanzee, you find it disgusting. Aren't authors shameless?
Are we unique?
No.
We're not.
No. We have better technology, but the same, but similar intent.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi. I enjoyed the book very much.
Thank you.
To reread it.
And we'll see you Sunday.
See you Sunday. Good.
In 10 seconds, what has religion done? What's its impact on it?
There's the chapter from democracy to kleptocracy, or vice versa, has something about religion.
I'll read it tonight, ask you again on Sunday.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. When can we expect the next book on technology?
The manuscript due date is, I think, 2003. So with luck, 2004, early 2005. Hi.
Go ahead. I'm going to just up here and get a nice tight shot of the book for a little bit.
I'm curious, did you read very much science fiction at any point in time?
I did when I was a teenager, but I have not read any since I was a teenager.
Likewise.
Yeah. Hi.
Bennett Nonton.
You have to spell it too.
Bennett.
Okay. Bennett.
ETT.
Yeah.